MagicExpression.com.
When I was a kid, we didn't have cinematic universes that were planned decades in advance, where you could look at a calendar and know 10 years from now what movie you were going to be seeing in a theater. That's not how it worked. When a movie came out that you enjoyed and you thought there should be a sequel to this, you had to just wait and see. Maybe if you were like me, you caught a little snippet of news somewhere, because I paid attention to movie news because I was so into it as a kid. But otherwise, you just had to wait and hope that you saw a trailer somewhere or a commercial would come on TV. And then you'd know, oh, this movie I've been waiting for is finally coming out. That was the case with Back to the Future Part 2. I have here my Back to the Future trilogy steelbook. Back to the Future came out in '85. I would have been 5 years old. I was very into it. It was one of my favorite movies. It was up there with Superman, Ghostbusters, Star Wars. I'd say those were the four when I was a kid. Those were the four that I just was obsessed with. I must have watched the VHS cassette of Back to the Future a million times. And the thing is, when I was a kid, the movie came out in theaters. It did not say, the DeLorean didn't fly to the screen and then it said to be continued. That wasn't until later. They put that on to the VHS and TV versions of Back to the Future, which would have been what I saw. I wouldn't have seen it in the theaters. And so it says to be continued. Well, where's the rest of the story? I didn't get it. I didn't understand. So I was so happy when they announced not only Back to the Future 2, but 3 would be filmed back to back. I was 9 years old. I go to the theater. I sit down for Back to the Future 2. Blew me away. I loved it. I love it to this day. It is not quite as good as Back to the Future, but it's not far off. This is a sequel the way a sequel should be done. And as I understand it, a lot of people do prefer Part 2 to Part 1. For us, it was, 4 years later. For Marty and Doc, it was, the next second. Back to the Future Part 2 literally picks up immediately where Back to the Future 1 ended. So much so that they refilmed the ending of Part 2, or Part 1, because they couldn't get the actress who played Marty's girlfriend to come back. So they replaced her with Elizabeth Shue, which is one of the rare times where somebody's recast that I not only am okay with it, I wish she had been in Part 1. Because Elizabeth Shue really brought that character to life. In Part 1, she's just the girlfriend. I mean, you don't really spend that much time with her. She's in the beginning of the movie a little bit. She's in the end of the movie a little bit. And that's it. You don't really see her outside of that. But Part 2, she has a much bigger part, and Elizabeth Shue was able to really bring something to it. Unfortunately, by all this stuff, refilming all this stuff and everything, it becomes apparent, especially when you're comparing, the actual end of Part 1 to the beginning of Part 2, how much Michael J. Fox has aged. Christopher Lloyd doesn't miss a beat. He's Doc Brown. He looks like Doc Brown. Nothing's different. He looks fine. But Michael J. Fox has definitely aged. He's no longer looks like he's 17 years old. He's, I think, 30 at the time that they're filming the movie. And so it's just distracting somewhat to see him, go like he's supposed to be a high school student. It's one of those things where, sometimes in my mind, I think, what would I do? What would I do to movies that I love, movies that I think are great, but that I would tweak a little bit. And definitely de-aging Michael J. Fox would be one of the things that I would do. he's not believable anymore as a high school student. You could get away with it when you're like 24, not so much when you're 30. The movie is fantastic in that it unlike the first one where you just go back to 1955, you're jumping around all the different, from the future of 2015, which, now in 2021 we look at and maybe wish that was the future that we had gotten. But, and then back to an alternate 1985 because something had been changed in the past, so they got to go back to 1955 in order to fix it. It does what a sequel should do. It really ramps everything up, and it makes you, it shows you all the different facets of what the world can be, which I think is why Back to the Future 3 was always one that I was a little disappointed with. A lot of people sort of regard as the lesser of the three, because you're really, after the jumping around in part 2, when you just sort of settle into one time period for the entire movie, and it's the Old West, and everything is slower, the energy of part 2 is gone. It doesn't have that fast pace to it. That's not to say 3 is bad. I love part 3. I can't watch just Back to the Future. If I pop in Back to the Future, I guarantee I'm marathoning the entire trilogy. Because it does feel like one story, much in the way that the Lord of the Rings trilogy does. There's not many franchises that do that, where you get that feeling that it's one story. Even like an overarching thing like the MCU or Star Wars. Time has passed between sequels. You know what I mean? You know that, like, the events of Empire Strikes Back don't happen immediately after the events of Star Wars. Not so with Back to the Future. Back to the Future is one long story. It is a shame what happened to Michael J. Fox, because the guy, he was a master. People really forget, because he's really primarily remembered for Back to the Future at this point. Family Ties has been kind of, it's an 80s relic, and a lot of the movies that he tried to do, whether they were comedies like Secret of My Success or Doc Hollywood, or dramas like Casualties of War and Light of Day, they just didn't click with audiences. He never really became a movie star outside of Back to the Future. He kept making movies, but he never really replicated the success of Back to the Future, which is a damn shame, because I think people just maybe didn't know how to use him. With the exception of, I think Casualties of War is an extremely underrated movie. I think a lot of people have caught on to it since its release, but at the time it didn't really connect. I think a lot of people dismissed it because, it's, Alex P. Keaton in a Vietnam War movie. No, thank you. But he's fantastic in it. And really, Back to the Future, you see he's Chaplin. He's Buster Keaton. He is a master comedian in these movies. Physical comedian. His timing is perfect. He is on target with every little thing he does in this movie. There is not a moment in this movie that is wasted with him. He captures every single second that he can. And he has Christopher Lloyd as a partner. And Christopher Lloyd is another one where maybe he had more success because he could kind of be in the smaller parts in movies, and you could put him in Who Framed Roger Rabbit or something. But he never replicated the success of Doc Brown, so much so that you see him kind of come back to that part in TV commercials or Million Ways to Die in the West or Robot Chicken. If Doc Brown is being put in something, Christopher Lloyd will do it, because that was his golden period. That was the moment that he captured everybody's imagination as this mad scientist that you wish you were friends with so you could go on this adventure because the adventure was fun. That's the thing with all three Back to the Future movies. The overarching thing, it's fun, start to finish. There are the highs and lows, but even during the lows, you know, that Alan Silvestri score kicks in, and Zemeckis' direction, you get a movie that just, you wish you were in. You wish you could look back and this was your adventure that you had. So part two, again, it's a, you know, part one, part two, part three. You know, diminishing returns, but they don't diminish enough to where it, you know, takes away from, you know, where you look at the quality of 1, 2, and 3, and you go, well, they really dropped the ball making this one. They're all great movies. Part 2, 4.5 out of 5 stars. Back to the Future is obviously a 5. Back to the Future 3 is probably a 4. But part 2 falls right in the middle. It's a 4.5. It's a great movie without quite reaching that. You know, Back to the Future is a classic. Maybe that's what a 5-star is. It's a classic. Whereas a 4 is a great movie. 4.5, it almost got there. And you know what? You can't fault a movie for that. That is, not every movie is a 4.5. You know, it's rare that you find a 4.5. So they should always be celebrated, even if they don't quite make it to the point of being a classic. Back to the Future Part 2 is absolutely a worthy sequel to one of, in my opinion, the greatest movies of all time.
The worlds.
Sort of gave myself the challenge of, okay,